Iranian naval doctrine was not designed to defeat the United States Navy in a conventional engagement. It was designed to make victory so costly that the United States chooses not to fight. This is the scenario that keeps Pentagon planners awake. In this hypothetical engagement, we analyze what would likely occur. If a United States Navy carrier strike group were to face a massed swarm attack in the restricted waters of the Strait of Hormuz, in this scenario, the geography of the region serves as a primary combatant. The strait, which at its narrowest point is only 21 nautical miles wide, forces a modern naval formation into a confined space, where its greatest advantage, standoff range, is significantly neutralized. Defense analysts have modeled this scenario to understand the breaking point of layered naval defenses. If a carrier strike group, led by a Nimitz-class, or Geraldar, Ford-class aircraft carrier, were to transit these waters during a period of high tension, it would be shadowed by dozens of small, high-speed vessels. These are the fast attack craft and fast inshore attack craft of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. To the United States Navy, these vessels represent 1,000 stings doctrine. In a hypothetical engagement, the conflict would not begin with a massive missile exchange from hundreds of miles away. Instead, wargame models suggest it would likely start with a rapid transition from gray zone harassment to a coordinated saturation strike. The core analytical question is whether the Aegis Combat System, designed to track and intercept sophisticated Soviet-era supersonic missiles, can effectively manage 50 to 100 small, low-profile, highly maneuverable surface targets simultaneously. Based on known capabilities, the Iranian force would likely utilize a mix of Peykaap-class torpedo boats and Zolfaghar-class missile boats. These vessels are capable of speeds exceeding 50 knots, with some specialized hulls reaching nearly 100 knots. In this scenario, analysts believe the primary threat is not any single boat, but the mathematical reality of the swarm. If 60 boats were to launch 2 anti-ship cruise missiles each, the defensive screen of the carrier strike group would be forced to intercept 120 incoming threats in a window of less than 3 minutes. If this engagement were to occur, the United States Navy would rely on its tiered defense concept. This begins with the F/A-18 Super Hornet and the F-35 Charlie, providing an outer air screen to identify and neutralize threats before they reach missile launch range. However, in the narrow confines of the northern Persian Gulf, the reaction time for these pilots would be measured in seconds. Analysis suggests that the sheer volume of civilian traffic in these waters would complicate the rules of engagement, potentially allowing the swarm to close within a lethal distance before a hostile act is officially declared. Under these hypothetical conditions, the United States Navy would likely deploy at least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers as the primary shield for the carrier. These vessels are equipped with the AN/SPY-6 or AN/SPY-1 radar system, designed to feed data into the Aegis Combat System. This system is the most capable naval defense architecture in the world. Yet even its proponents acknowledge a theoretical limit. In a hypothetical saturation attack, the number of incoming tracks could potentially exceed the number of available illuminators or active guidance channels, creating a gap in the defensive umbrella. In this scenario, the outcome is genuinely uncertain because it pits 2 diametrically opposed philosophies of war against one another. On one side is the United States, utilizing the most expensive and technologically advanced platforms ever built, designed for precision and survivability. On the other side is an Iranian doctrine that accepts high attrition in exchange for a single successful hit on a high-value target. Wargame analysts suggest that in this environment, a mission kill rendering a carrier unable to launch aircraft is nearly as strategically significant as sinking the vessel itself. If these forces were to meet, the world would witness a test of whether 17th century swarm tactics, updated with 21st century missile technology, can overcome the most sophisticated electronic shield ever devised. This analysis examines the mechanics of that collision, the likely points of failure for both sides, and the staggering cost of an engagement where there are no easy victories. To understand how this hypothetical engagement would likely unfold, one must first analyze the specific capabilities and strategic logic of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Unlike most traditional navies, the Iranian force does not seek to mirror the United States Navy in size or tonnage. Instead, defense analysts note that Iranian doctrine is built entirely around the concept of asymmetry, specifically designed to exploit the geographic constraints of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. In this scenario, the primary Iranian force would likely consist of a massive number of small, highly mobile platforms. The centerpiece of this fleet is the Peykaap-class fast attack craft. These vessels are approximately 45 feet in length, but are capable of reaching speeds over 50 knots. Analysts believe that in a hypothetical engagement, these boats would be armed with 2 short-range anti-ship cruise missiles or dual torpedo tubes. While a single Peykaap does not possess the firepower to destroy a destroyer, the Iranian strategy relies on the cumulative effect of dozens of such vessels attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. Beyond the Peykaap, the Iranian force would likely deploy the Zolfaghar-class missile boat. This platform is slightly larger and carries the Nasr-1 anti-ship missile, which is a highly capable subsonic weapon with a range of approximately 20 miles. In a hypothetical conflict, these boats would not operate in a standard naval line of battle. Instead, doctrine indicates they would hide in the numerous coves and inlets of the Iranian coastline, utilizing the radar clutter of the rugged terrain to mask their positions from United States Navy surveillance. Wargame models suggest that the greatest strength of this force is its low signature, high-density nature. Because these boats are constructed primarily of fiberglass or aluminum, they present a much smaller radar cross-section than a conventional warship. When dozens of these craft are moving at high speeds in a confined waterway, they create a chaotic tactical environment. This is often referred to by military analysts as a saturated target environment, where the sheer volume of contacts can potentially overwhelm the tracking and fire control capacity of even the most modern defense systems. Furthermore, Iranian doctrine emphasizes the use of what analysts call swarm intelligence. If this engagement were to occur, the Iranian flotillas would likely be coordinated by land-based command centers using redundant, low-bandwidth communication links that are difficult to jam. In this hypothetical, the boats would likely close the distance to the carrier strike group in a disorganized, chaotic formation until they reach the launch basket for their missiles. At that moment, they would likely fire all their ordnance at once, creating a wall of incoming missiles arriving from 360 degrees. However, this doctrine also has significant weaknesses that analysts have identified. The small size of these vessels means they have very limited endurance and almost no defensive capabilities of their own. In this scenario, they would be extremely vulnerable to the United States Navy's airborne assets before they could even get within range to fire. Furthermore, the Iranian command and control structure, while redundant, would likely be a primary target for United States electronic warfare. If the coordination between the boats were to be severed, the swarm would likely lose its ability to synchronize its strikes, turning a coordinated saturation attack into a series of isolated, manageable engagements. Defense analysts also point out that the Iranian force is highly dependent on optical and short-range radar systems. In this hypothetical, weather conditions or heavy smoke from initial exchanges could significantly degrade their ability to accurately target carrier. Despite these limitations, the Iranian force is treated with significant respect by Pentagon planners. Their doctrine is a rational response to an overwhelming technological gap. It is a system designed for a single purpose: to turn the Strait of Hormuz into a no-go zone by utilizing high-speed, expendable platforms to trade lives for strategic damage. In this scenario, the Iranian force represents a credible threat because it does not require a high degree of technological sophistication to succeed. It only requires a high degree of commitment and a sufficient number of boats to survive the initial American defensive salvos. If even a small percentage of the swarm penetrates the inner screen, the Iranian mission could be considered a tactical success. If this engagement were to occur, the primary defense of the United States Navy would rest on the concept of layered lethality, managed by the Aegis Combat System. In this hypothetical scenario, the carrier strike group would likely be anchored defensively by 2 or 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. These vessels represent the most sophisticated integrated air and missile defense architecture ever deployed at sea. At the heart of this defense is the Aegis Combat System, which serves as the brain of the entire formation. Analysis suggests that the primary advantage of the United States Navy is its ability to create a common tactical picture. Utilizing the E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye, a carrier-based early warning aircraft, the strike group would likely detect Iranian fast boats the moment they leave their piers. In this scenario, the Hawkeye would relay high-resolution tracking data to the destroyers via Link 16, allowing the escorts to engage targets that are still well below their own horizon. The first layer of defense would likely be the carrier air wing. FA-18 Super Hornets and F-35 Charlie fighters would be tasked with the outer air battle. If the swarm were to begin its high-speed run, these aircraft would likely utilize AGM-88 HARM missiles or laser-guided munitions to thin the ranks of the Iranian flotilla before they reach their missile launch points. Defense analysts believe that the United States Navy's ability to engage at standoff range is its greatest strength. But in the narrow confines of the strait, this layer could be compressed to almost nothing. The second layer consists of the Standard Missile family, specifically the Standard Missile 6 and the Standard Missile 2. These are the long-range interceptors. In this hypothetical engagement, the Standard Missile 6 would be used not just against incoming missiles, but potentially as a high-speed anti-ship weapon against the larger Iranian missile boats. Analysts suggest that the precision of these interceptors is unmatched, yet they represent a significant cost-to-target mismatch. Using a multi-million-dollar missile to destroy a fast boat is a tactical necessity that creates a strategic depletion of the vessel's vertical launch system. As the swarm closes within 20 miles, the defense would transition to the evolved Sea Sparrow missile and the rolling airframe missile. These systems are designed for high-density, short-range engagements. The rolling airframe missile, in particular, is highly regarded by naval analysts for its fire-and-forget capability, allowing a destroyer to engage multiple incoming targets simultaneously without requiring constant radar illumination. The final, or inner, layer is the close-in weapon system, often referred to as the phalanx. This is a 20mm radar-guided Gatling gun designed to create a wall of tungsten at a range of less than 1 mile. In this scenario, if an Iranian missile or a fast boat were to penetrate all other layers, the close-in weapon system would activate automatically. While highly effective, it is a point defense system, meaning it can only protect the ship it is mounted on, not the carrier several miles away. Despite this formidable technology, defense analysts have identified a critical vulnerability: vertical launch system depth. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries between 90 and 96 missile cells. Once these are fired, the ship cannot be reloaded at sea. If an Iranian swarm attack were to involve 100 boats and a coordinated barrage of land-based missiles, the destroyers would likely exhaust their primary interceptors within minutes. In this hypothetical, the magazine depth of the United States Navy is a finite resource that the Iranian doctrine is specifically designed to deplete. Furthermore, analysts believe that the Aegis system's reliance on high-powered radar makes it a target for electronic warfare. While the United States leads in this field, a sufficiently dense environment of radar clutter and deceptive jamming from the Iranian shoreline could potentially degrade the SPY-1 radar's ability to discriminate between a fast boat and a wave crest. In this scenario, the United States Navy's strength lies in its precision and integration. Its weakness lies in the mathematical reality of a saturation threshold. If the number of incoming threats exceeds the number of available interceptors in the air at any given second, the shield for the first time in modern history could break. In this hypothetical engagement, the opening phase would likely be characterized not by a sudden explosion, but by a tense, rapid transition from gray zone maneuvering to kinetic conflict. Defense analysts suggest that the environment in the Strait of Hormuz would already be saturated with hundreds of commercial vessels, making the initial identification of hostile intent the most difficult task for the United States Navy commanders. If this scenario were to unfold, the carrier strike group would likely be operating in a state of heightened readiness, with its electronic eyes pushed as far forward as the geography allows. Analysts believe that the first indication of an imminent attack would likely come from the MH-60 Sierra helicopters, flying plane guard and surface surveillance patterns around the carrier. In this scenario, these helicopters would observe a sudden change in the behavior of the Iranian fast boats that typically shadow the formation. Instead of maintaining a parallel course, the boats would likely begin to vector or turn directly toward the carrier's screen at speeds exceeding 40 knots. Wargame models predict that the Iranian flotilla would attempt to mask its numbers by grouping tightly together, appearing as large, indistinct blobs on the SPY-1 radar of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. However, the E-2 Delta Advanced Hawkeye, orbiting high above the strike group, would likely use its AN/APY-9 radar to look through the sea, clutter, and identify individual hulls. At this point, the carrier group commander would be faced with a critical decision. In this hypothetical, the rules of engagement would call for a determination of hostile intent before opening fire. If the engagement were to occur, the first contact would likely be electronic. Analysis suggests the United States Navy would utilize high-powered jamming to disrupt the Iranian boat-to-boat communications simultaneously. The destroyers would likely broadcast warnings over international maritime distress frequencies. In this scenario, the failure of the Iranian vessels to alter course or respond would likely be interpreted as the final confirmation of a coordinated attack. As the swarm crosses the 20-mile threshold, analysts believe the United States Navy would likely launch its first defensive salvos. Doctrine would call for the MH-60 Sierra helicopters to engage the leading edge of the swarm using Hellfire missiles and door-mounted machine guns. This initial exchange is designed to break the wave to disrupt the synchronization of the swarm before the boats can reach their own missile launch points. In this hypothetical, the Iranian response would likely be to accelerate. Doctrine indicates that the fast boats would split into smaller cells of 3 to 5 vessels, zigzagging to complicate the targeting solutions of the American ships. Analysis suggests that as these boats enter the 15-mile range, they would likely begin to launch their Nasser 1 and Kosar anti-ship missiles, Because these missiles are launched from such a low altitude, they would stay below the radar horizon of the destroyers for as long as possible, appearing on the Aegis displays only when they are seconds away from impact. Defense analysts have noted that this is the moment where the fog of war becomes a physical reality. If this engagement were to occur, the air would likely be filled with hundreds of metallic decoys and chaff clouds launched by the United States ships to confuse the incoming Iranian missiles. The sheer volume of outgoing fire from the carrier's escorts would likely be staggering. Standard Missile 2 and Evolved Sea Sparrow missiles would be leaving the vertical launch cells at intervals of less than 2 seconds. In this scenario, the opening phase concludes when the first Iranian boats are neutralized, but the momentum of the swarm remains unchecked. Analysts believe that even if the United States Navy manages to destroy 20% of the attacking force in the first 3 minutes, the remaining boats would still possess enough mass to threaten the carrier. The engagement would now move into the escalation phase, where the land-based Iranian assets would likely enter the fray to complicate the defensive picture for the Aegis system. This phase demonstrates the primary challenge of littoral warfare: the proximity of the threat in a hypothetical engagement in the Strait of Hormuz. There is no long range. Every move is a close-quarters maneuver, and the transition from peace to a high-intensity firefight happens in the time it takes a fast boat to cross 5 miles of water. In this hypothetical escalation, the engagement would likely shift from a localized surface skirmish into a complex, multi-axis battle. Analysis suggests that as the Iranian fastboat swarm enters the 10-mile outer ring of the carrier's screen, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps would likely activate its land-based anti-ship cruise missile batteries hidden along the rugged coastline of the Hormozgan province. Wargame models indicate that this is the moment where Iranian doctrine seeks to achieve saturation by launching land-based missiles such as the Noor or the long-range Gator simultaneously with the fast boat attack. The adversary forces the United States Navy's Aegis Combat System to divide its processing power and interceptor inventory between 2 fundamentally different types of threats. In this scenario, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers would be forced to track low-flying cruise missiles coming from the shore while simultaneously engaging dozens of high-speed surface contacts closing from the sea. If this scenario unfolded, the role of electronic warfare would become the decisive factor. Analysts believe the United States Navy would likely deploy the EA-18G Growler to the forefront of the engagement. These specialized aircraft would likely use their ALQ-99 or the newer next-generation jammer pods to flood the Iranian coastal radars with noise, attempting to blind the missile batteries before they can achieve a solid fire control lock on the carrier. However, defense analysts note that Iranian doctrine utilizes passive electro-optical sensors and human spotters on the islands of Abu Musa and the Tums. In this hypothetical, the carrier strike group commander would face a critical decision point: whether to authorize kinetic strikes against land-based targets. Based on known doctrine, the United States Navy would likely prefer to stay in a defensive posture to avoid further escalation. But if the volume of incoming missiles exceeds a certain threshold, the self-defense rules of engagement would likely trigger a counter-battery response. FA-18 Super Hornets, armed with AGM-88 HARM missiles, would likely be vectored toward the Iranian coastline to suppress the integrated air defense systems. As the engagement escalates, analysts suggest that the magazine depth of the United States ships would become the primary concern for the tactical action officers. In this scenario, every Standard Missile 6 or Evolved Sea Sparrow missile fired at an incoming drone or boat is one less interceptor available for a high-speed cruise missile. Wargame simulations have shown that Iranian forces might intentionally use low-cost, slow-moving suicide drones to bait the Aegis system into wasting its most capable and expensive interceptors. This interceptor depletion tactic is a key component of modern asymmetric naval warfare. To counter this, the United States Navy would likely utilize the Nulka active missile decoy. In this hypothetical, the Nulka, a hovering rocket that mimics the radar signature of a large ship, would be launched from the destroyers to lure incoming Iranian missiles away from the carrier and its escorts. Analysts believe the effectiveness of these decoys would be tested to their absolute limit in the narrow waters of the strait. Doctrine indicates that during this phase, the carrier itself would likely begin a series of high-speed maneuvers to present a more difficult target and to optimize the wind over deck for continuous flight operations. In this scenario, the Nimitz-class or Ford-class carrier would be moving at speeds exceeding 30 knots, creating a massive wake that could potentially disrupt the stability of the smaller Iranian fast boats. However, defense analysts point out that high-speed maneuvers in restricted waters carry their own risks, including the potential for groundings or collisions with the heavy commercial traffic that characterizes the region. If these forces were to meet in such a compressed environment, the fog of war would likely be compounded by the sheer density of electronic signals, smoke from intercepted missiles, and the chaotic movement of hundreds of vessels. Analysis suggests that the Iranian side would likely use this chaos to launch second-wave attacks from unexpected directions, perhaps utilizing semi-submersible vessels or midget submarines of the Ghadir class to lay mines or fire torpedoes while the escorts are distracted by the surface and air threats. This phase of the engagement represents the ultimate test of the United States Navy's network-centric warfare concept. Success in this scenario depends on the ability of every ship and aircraft in the strike group to share data seamlessly, ensuring that no two ships fire at the same target, and that every incoming threat is prioritized by lethality. If the data link were to be degraded by Iranian jamming, the formation would likely revert to decentralized defense, where each ship fights its own local battle, a situation that significantly increases the probability of a successful Iranian penetration. The turning point of this hypothetical engagement would likely occur within the inner 5 to 7 miles of the carrier's defensive screen. In this scenario, defense analysts believe the critical moment is defined not by a single heroic action, but by a mathematical calculation: the saturation of the Aegis Combat System's fire control channels. If this engagement were to reach this stage, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers would likely have exhausted a significant portion of their long-range Standard Missile 6 and Standard Missile 2 inventories. Wargame models suggest that as the remaining Iranian fast boats and land-based cruise missiles converge, the defensive task transitions from area defense to point defense. In this hypothetical, the sheer density of incoming targets would likely force the Aegis system into what is known as terminal phase priority. Analysis suggests that even the most modern SPY-1 or SPY-6 radar systems have a finite number of targets they can illuminate for semi-active missile guidance at any single moment. If the Iranian swarm were to launch a coordinated volley of 30 missiles from multiple directions, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer might find its fire control illuminators completely occupied. Analysts believe this is the window of opportunity Iranian doctrine is designed to create. If 31 threats arrive simultaneously, the 31st threat essentially has a clear path to the ship's hull. In this scenario, the critical moment would be the transition to the RIM 116 rolling airframe missile and the close-in weapon system. Unlike the larger Standard missiles, the rolling airframe missile is an autonomous, heat-seeking, and radio frequency homing interceptor. It does not require the ship's radar to guide it to the target. Doctrine indicates that the United States Navy would rely on these fire-and-forget systems to manage the overflow of targets that the main Aegis shield cannot address. However, defense analysts point out a sobering reality. The rolling airframe missile has a very short range, measured in less than 5 miles. This means the intercept would likely happen so close to the United States ships that even a successful hit could result in shrapnel damage, or a soft kill from the debris of the intercepted missile. In this hypothetical, the survival of the destroyer or the carrier would depend on the system's ability to achieve a catastrophic kill, exploding the incoming warhead rather than just damaging the airframe. During this critical moment, the tactical action officers inside the Combat Information Center would be operating under extreme psychological pressure. Analysis suggests that the speed of the engagement would likely exceed human cognitive limits, forcing the commander to switch the Aegis system to auto special mode. In this state, the computer, not the human, decides which targets to engage and which weapons to fire. This is a moment where doctrine meets the limit of technology. If the system performs as designed, it would likely neutralize the vast majority of the swarm. But if even one sensor is degraded by Iranian electronic warfare or the smoke of previous explosions, a lethal gap could open. Wargame analysts have noted that in several simulations, this is the point where a single Iranian missile, perhaps one of the older but still effective C-802 variants, manages to slip through the defensive net while the Aegis system is busy processing 50 other higher priority tracks. In this scenario, the advantage would likely shift based on whether the United States Navy can maintain situational awareness during the peak of the saturation. If the data link between the carrier and its escorts remains intact, the formation can distribute the targets efficiently. If the link is severed, each ship would likely overengage the same targets, wasting precious interceptors and allowing other threats to penetrate. This is the moment that determines the outcome of the battle. It is the point where the Iranian doctrine of quantity over quality is tested against the American philosophy of technological overmatch. There is no middle ground in this phase. Either the shield holds, or the carrier strike group takes a hit that would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape of the 21st century. In this hypothetical exchange, the theoretical models of both navies would be subjected to the brutal reality of high-intensity littoral combat. Analysis suggests that while the United States Navy possesses a vast technological advantage, the sheer density of the engagement would ensure that neither side emerges unscathed. If this engagement were to occur, the primary casualty for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would be its surface flotilla. Wargame models predict that in the first 10 minutes of kinetic contact, as many as 40 to 60% of the Iranian fast boats would be neutralized. United States Navy MH-60 Sierra helicopters, operating from the decks of the escorts, would likely achieve a high kill ratio using AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and 20mm cannons, the Shahid Soleimani-class corvettes, while significantly more capable with their own vertical launch systems and stealth-inspired catamaran hulls, would likely become the highest priority targets for United States strike packages. Analysts believe that FA-18 Super Hornets would utilize long-range anti-ship missiles to neutralize these corvettes before they could fully integrate their long-range Sayyad 3 Charlie missiles into the swarm's coordination. However, the cost for the United States Navy would be measured in more than just expended ammunition. In this scenario, defense analysts acknowledge that the perfect shield is a myth. As the swarm reaches its peak density, at least one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would likely suffer a mission kill. Analysis suggests that even if the Aegis system intercepts 99% of the incoming threats, the kinetic energy and debris from a successful terminal phase intercept can still cause devastating damage. If a large anti-ship missile like the Ghadir were intercepted only 500 yards from a destroyer, The resulting rain of supersonic fragments would likely shred the ship's sensitive radar arrays and communication antennas. In this hypothetical, the destroyer would remain afloat, but it would be effectively blind and unable to continue its defensive mission. The aircraft carrier itself would not be immune to the effects of the exchange. While doctrine calls for the carrier to remain in the inner sanctum of the formation, wargame results often indicate that stray missiles or leaking fast boats can penetrate the final layer of defense. In this scenario, analysts believe the carrier would likely sustain superficial but strategically significant damage to its flight deck or hangar bays. A single successful hit from a small caliber weapon or a near miss from a drone could result in a fire that temporarily halts flight operations. In the logic of naval warfare, a carrier that cannot launch or recover its F-35 Charlie fighters is a vessel that has lost its primary reason for existence. Furthermore, the United States Navy would face a critical stockpile crisis during the exchange. Based on observations from recent regional conflicts, in 2024 and 2025, the rate of interceptor expenditure would be unsustainable. If a single destroyer fires 80% of its vertical launch cells in a 15-minute window, it ceases to be a defensive asset and becomes a liability that must be escorted out of the combat zone. Defense analysts have noted that the United States lacks the ability to reload these cells at sea, meaning the strike group's overall combat power would degrade exponentially with every minute of the engagement. On the Iranian side, the losses would be catastrophic in terms of personnel and platforms. Analysis suggests that the Revolutionary Guard would likely accept the total destruction of its fast boat wings if it meant achieving a single, verifiable strike on an American capital ship. This asymmetric victory is the core of their doctrine, even as their harbors are struck by Tomahawk cruise missiles in a counterforce response. The successful engagement of a carrier would be framed as a strategic success that justifies the loss of dozens of expendable vessels. In this hypothetical, the exchange is an honest assessment of vulnerability. The United States Navy wins the tactical battle through superior sensors and layered fire, but it does so at the cost of a significant portion of its regional missile inventory and the mission capability of one or more multi-billion-dollar hulls. This result confirms what many naval analysts have long warned: in the restricted waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the exchange is never one-sided. In this hypothetical outcome, the engagement would likely conclude not with a total surrender, but with a calculated withdrawal by the surviving Iranian forces. Analysis suggests that once the saturation threshold has been tested and the initial magazine of both the land-based batteries and the fast boat flotillas has been exhausted, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would likely retreat into the radar clutter of the Iranian coastline and the complex geography of the islands. Wargame models indicate that the United States Navy would likely hold the field, maintaining its presence in the Strait of Hormuz. However, the state of the carrier strike group would be fundamentally altered. In this scenario, the United States would likely have achieved its tactical objective of neutralizing the immediate threat, but the physical and logistical cost would be staggering. Defense analysts believe that while no major United States ship would be permanently sunk, at least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers would likely be classified as mission killed. These vessels would likely remain afloat, but with their Aegis arrays shattered and their vertical launch cells empty. They would no longer be capable of providing air defense for the carrier. Based on known capabilities, the loss of life and equipment on the Iranian side would be severe. If this engagement were to occur, analysts estimate that over 60 fast attack craft and at least 3 Shahid Soleimani-class corvettes would be destroyed. The Iranian Thousand Stings Doctrine would have been executed. And in the process, the bulk of their regional surface strike capability would likely be spent for the Iranian leadership. However, the tactical destruction of their fleet might be viewed as a secondary concern compared to the strategic message sent by the engagement. In this hypothetical, the aircraft carrier, the centerpiece of American power projection, would likely be forced to withdraw from the Persian Gulf. Even if the vessel sustained only minor damage to its flight deck or sensor mast, the risk of a second wave attack against a depleted escort screen would likely be deemed unacceptable by the United States Central Command. Analysis suggests that the carrier would likely be escorted to a friendly port in the Gulf of Oman or the Arabian Sea for repairs. And, more importantly, for the complex process of reloading its escort's vertical launch systems. The outcome of this scenario would likely be characterized as a United States victory with a heavy cost. The United States Navy would have demonstrated that its layered defenses can, in fact, survive a massed swarm attack. But the invincibility of the carrier strike group would be punctured. In the language of naval strategy, the Iranian forces would have achieved sea denial, making the waters of the strait too dangerous for sustained operations, without risking the loss of a multi-billion-dollar asset. Losses on both sides would be specific and honest. For the United States, 2 destroyers heavily damaged and mission killed. A dozen aircraft lost to surface-to-air fire or deck accidents during the chaos. And hundreds of sailors wounded or lost. For Iran, the near-total depletion of its modern fast-boat wings, the destruction of multiple land-based radar sites, and significant personnel losses. This scenario does not end with a decisive strategic resolution. Instead, it ends with a sobering assessment of modern naval vulnerability. The United States would still hold the strait, but the price in ships, aircraft, and the depletion of rare missile inventories would be higher than most pre-war models suggest. That gap between expectation and reality is itself the most significant outcome of the engagement. The tactical win for the United States would be overshadowed by the strategic reality that a lower-tier adversary, utilizing asymmetric means, could successfully force a superpower to withdraw its most prestigious platform from a contested waterway. This hypothetical engagement provides a critical framework for understanding the limitations of modern naval power in confined waters. Analysis of this scenario yields 3 primary lessons that defense planners believe would redefine future maritime doctrine. The first and most significant lesson is the reality of magazine depth versus saturation density. In this scenario, the United States Navy's reliance on the vertical launch system, while technologically superior, revealed a finite threshold. Analysis suggests that even with a 99% intercept rate, the mathematical advantage lies with the side that can field more targets than the defender has interceptors. If a destroyer exhausts its inventory of standard missiles and evolved Sea Sparrow missiles within 20 minutes, it ceases to be a shield and becomes a liability. This highlights a critical need for what analysts call rearm at sea capabilities, such as the transferable rearm mechanism, which was in testing phases in early 2026. Without the ability to reload missile cells in a combat zone, a carrier strike group's endurance is strictly limited by the capacity of its escort's hulls. The second lesson concerns the littoral trap created by geography. In this hypothetical, the Strait of Hormuz acted as a force multiplier for Iranian asymmetric doctrine. Defense analysts have noted that the restricted maneuver space neutralized the carrier's primary advantage, standoff distance. In a hypothetical engagement, the gray zone between monitoring a threat and engaging it is too narrow. When a 100-knot fast boat can close the distance to a carrier in less than 5 minutes, the human-in-the-loop decision-making process is pushed to its breaking point. This scenario suggests that future littoral defense must rely more heavily on autonomous systems and missile mules, unmanned surface vessels that can carry additional interceptors and serve as expendable screens for the high-value capital ships. The third lesson is the evolution of the Iranian mothership concept. exemplified by the Shahid Suleimani-class corvette. Analysis suggests that these catamarans, with their own vertical launch systems and ability to coordinate fast boat cells, have transformed the swarm from a disorganized mass into a structured, tiered threat. In this scenario, the presence of these corvettes as command and control nodes forced the United States to prioritize them for early destruction, effectively diverting fire away from the incoming missiles. This indicates that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has successfully integrated conventional naval capabilities into its asymmetric routes, creating a hybrid threat that is significantly harder to dismantle than a simple speedboat swarm. From a policy perspective, this analysis suggests that the permanent stationing of a carrier strike group inside the Persian Gulf during high-tension periods carries a risk-to-reward ratio that may no longer be favorable. If this engagement were to occur, the strategic mission kill of a carrier would likely outweigh any tactical victory the United States might achieve on the water. Defense analysts believe that the region's security would likely shift toward a more distributed presence, utilizing smaller, more numerous littoral combat ships and unmanned platforms to maintain presence without risking the crown jewels of the fleet. Ultimately, this hypothetical scenario teaches us that in the 21st century, mass has a quality of its own. While the Aegis system remains the gold standard for naval defense, it is a system designed for a different era of warfare. In the narrow, cluttered, and chaotic waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the most important finding of this analysis is that victory is not a binary outcome, but a sliding scale of attrition where even the winner may find the cost of combat to be strategically unsustainable. The strategic consequences of this hypothetical engagement would likely reverberate far beyond the confines of the Strait of Hormuz. Analysis suggests that while the United States Navy would maintain its presence, the encounter would signal the end of the era of uncontested carrier supremacy in restricted waters. In this scenario, the primary implication is the shift from global presence to distributed lethality. Defense analysts believe that the damage sustained by the carrier strike group would lead to a fundamental reassessment of how the United States projects power in the Persian Gulf. Based on the 2026 conflict observations often referred to in wargames as Operation Epic Fury, planners would likely prioritize the deployment of smaller, more numerous autonomous platforms. If a single carrier represents a single point of failure, then a distributed network of unmanned surface vessels and semi-autonomous corvettes provides a more resilient alternative that can trade space and attrition more effectively than a capital ship. Furthermore, the engagement would likely accelerate the fielding of the transferable rearm mechanism, or TRAM. In this hypothetical, the inability of destroyers to reload their vertical launch cells at sea was the critical vulnerability that the Iranian swarm successfully exploited. Analysts suggest that by late 2026, the United States Navy would likely mandate that every combat logistics ship be equipped with TRAM capabilities, ensuring that a strike group can stay in the fight without having to withdraw for weeks to a secure port. This technological pivot would be a direct response to the magazine depth crisis identified during the engagement. For the region, the implications would be equally profound. In this scenario, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps would have demonstrated that it possesses the asymmetric capability to inflict damage on a superpower, even with their fleet decimated. The tactical success of hitting a carrier would likely be used to bolster domestic morale and enhance their status as a regional power. This creates a new normal where the cost of deterrence is significantly higher for the United States, potentially leading to a more permanent shift toward land-based air power and long-range precision strikes from outside the Second Island Chain or the Arabian Sea. Summary of outcome: the engagement concludes with a United States victory with heavy cost. While the Iranian fast boat swarm and land-based missile batteries are largely neutralized, the United States suffers significant platform damage. At least 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers are mission-killed, and the aircraft carrier is forced to withdraw from the Persian Gulf for repairs and rearming. The Iranian side achieves a tactical milestone by penetrating the Aegis shield, though at the cost of nearly their entire surface strike capability. Key analytical lessons. The saturation threshold is finite. Even the most advanced Aegis Combat System can be overwhelmed if the density of incoming threats exceeds the number of available fire control channels and interceptors. Magazine depth is the new strategic limit. In high-intensity littoral combat, the speed at which interceptors are expended far outpaces the current ability to replenish them, making rearm at sea the most critical naval requirement of the decade. Geography negates technology. Confined waterways like the Strait of Hormuz compress reaction times and nullify the standoff advantages of modern carrier air wings, making high-value assets inherently vulnerable. Asymmetry requires only one success. Iranian doctrine proved that a technically inferior force can achieve strategic effects by accepting massive losses in exchange for a single hit on a prestige target. This analysis is based on publicly available information and modeled military doctrine. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict, such as specific weather conditions, human performance under fire, and the exact state of electronic warfare readiness at the moment of contact. This is a hypothetical scenario based on known military capabilities.